My friends, my fellow citizens, and people of goodwill everywhere, we are gathered here today, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters in the shared cause of peace and justice. And yet, there are those who would have us believe that the battles we fight are the same, that our struggles are bound together by the same forces of oppression. But I stand before you today to declare that your enemy is not my enemy. In the course of history, human beings have often found themselves divided by the challenges they face. These challenges are as diverse as the people who encounter them, shaping the course of their lives, the choices they make, and the paths they follow. It is easy, however, to overlook this diversity and assume that the struggles of one person or one group are identical to those of another. But in reality, every struggle is unique. This distinction is crucial for understanding that the enemy one faces in a given circumstance may not be the same for others. The idea that one person's battle must necessarily be mine as well is an oversimplification that blinds us to the complexity of the world and the varied sources of suffering and injustice that exist in it. The experiences of the oppressed, for example, are shaped by different contexts and histories. Take, for instance, the struggle of an individual in a war-torn country. Their enemy may be the oppressive regime that seeks to control their land, their culture, or their very existence. For them, their fight is about survival against an external force that threatens everything they know. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, a person fighting against economic inequality may face a different set of adversaries, such as the corporate powers and political systems that uphold systems of wealth disparity. Their enemy is not an army, but an entrenched system that uses economic and social mechanisms to maintain control. Both are struggles for justice, but their enemies are not the same. Similarly, consider the fight against racial injustice. In one country, individuals might be confronting state-sanctioned discrimination and violence, while in another, the fight may be against systemic racism that exists within institutions. These struggles for equality are intrinsically linked, yet the nature of the enemy varies. The enemy may be one group, but in another context it could be a different set of people or institutions entirely. The enemy, in this sense, is not a universal concept that binds all oppressed people together under a single banner. Rather, it is a specific manifestation of injustice in each unique setting, rooted in different structures of power. We must also acknowledge that not all enemies are external. For some, the struggle is internal, fought against the barriers of fear, doubt, and ignorance that have been instilled over a lifetime. These internal struggles can be just as fierce as any external battle. The person fighting for their sense of self-worth in a society that tells them they are inferior is engaged in a deeply personal fight, one that cannot be equated with the battle of another who faces outward aggression from forces they can easily identify. These struggles might overlap in some ways but must be understood for their individual contexts. This distinction between struggles is not meant to minimize the importance of solidarity. Rather, it calls us to recognize that while our ultimate goal might be the same justice, peace, equality, the paths we take to reach it may be different. Our experiences of oppression or hardship may be shaped by our unique circumstances, and as such, we must resist the urge to impose a single narrative on other struggles. The fact that two people may fight for the same ideals does not mean that they will fight the same fight. We must respect the complexity of their journeys and the differing enemies they must confront. Understanding the distinction of struggles also requires us to confront the broader forces at play. In many instances, the systems that create inequality and suffering are so vast and entrenched that they transcend individual struggles. The oppressors may not be the same in every case, but the systems that perpetuate oppression often share common threads. A person fighting for economic justice may find that the economic systems that keep them in poverty are tied to the same systems that enforce racial inequality or environmental degradation. In such cases, the struggle may seem different on the surface, but deeper examination reveals a shared enemy, one that operates across boundaries of race, geography, and circumstance. But even when the larger systems seem the same, we must acknowledge that the ways in which they manifest in different contexts can be very different. This distinction must be appreciated if we are to truly understand the experiences of others and avoid the simplistic notion that all struggles are the same. Our solidarity with others in their fight for justice is essential, but we must not expect their battles to mirror our own. The nuance of each individual's or community's struggle must be acknowledged if we are to build meaningful, respectful alliances. At the heart of recognizing these distinctions is the principle of empathy. By acknowledging that each person's struggle is shaped by their unique circumstances, we deepen our understanding of the diversity of the human experience. This empathy encourages us to listen, to understand, and to act in ways that respect the particularity of others' struggles while still working towards common goals. In recognizing that your enemy is not necessarily my enemy, we also gain the ability to recognize the humanity of others. We see their fight as part of their story, not merely a reflection of our own. By rejecting the idea that we are all fighting the same fight, we embrace a more nuanced understanding of the world, one that does not demand uniformity, but celebrates the richness of different struggles for justice. And in doing so, we can form alliances that are not based on the superficial alignment of enemies, but on a shared commitment to human dignity and the fight for a better world for all. Ultimately, the distinction of struggles is not about division or separation, it is about clarity and understanding. It is about recognizing that while our goals may align, the way we get there may be shaped by our own experiences and the unique challenges we face. The enemy may not always be the same, but our shared vision for a just world can unite us, even if the paths we walk are different. And in that unity, we find strength. Division has always been one of the most potent tools of oppression, used throughout history to fracture communities and prevent unity among people with shared struggles. It is a force that undermines the potential for collective action, the very thing that has brought about the most meaningful changes in society. The dangers of division are manifold and insidious, as it not only fosters conflict but also perpetuates injustice and hinders the possibility of a better, more equitable world. It is through division that the forces of power are able to maintain control, exploiting differences to distract from the true nature of oppression and inequality. One of the primary dangers of division is that it causes people to focus on the differences between them rather than on the things that unite them. These differences may be superficial, such as those based on ethnicity, religion, language, or social class, and yet they become magnified and weaponized to sow discord. It is easy to fall into the trap of believing that these divisions define who we are, that they make us irreconcilably different from others. But in truth, the things that divide us are often far less significant than the shared values and common human experiences that bind us together. The forces that seek to divide us exploit these divisions, turning them into tools of manipulation. By encouraging us to see each other as different, they prevent us from realizing that we are all human beings, facing many of the same struggles, desires, and hopes for a better future. This process of division is not always overt. It can be subtle, creeping into society through the media, through political rhetoric, and through the everyday interactions that shape our lives. A government or group in power may deliberately foster an us versus them mentality, creating the illusion that one group's gain is another's loss, and that the only way to protect one's own interests is to fight against others. The rhetoric of division often portrays those who are different, whether in terms of race, religion, or political beliefs, as threats, as enemies to be feared or marginalized. These messages are repeated so often that they become ingrained in our consciousness, shaping our attitudes and behavior. Once division takes root in society, it becomes a powerful force shaping policies, practices, and even personal relationships. The more deeply divided a society becomes, the harder it is to bridge the gaps between groups and build a common vision for the future. Another danger of division is that it diverts attention from the real sources of injustice and oppression. The true enemy of society is not the person who looks different, speaks differently, or practices a different faith. The real enemy is the system that perpetuates inequality, that keeps certain groups marginalized while benefiting others. But when people are divided along lines of difference, they are less likely to focus on these larger systemic issues. Instead, they are encouraged to fight each other, to blame each other for their problems. The powerful elite understand this well and use division as a strategy to keep the focus away from the systems of power that sustain their control. The more the people fight amongst themselves, the less likely they are to challenge the structures that oppress them all. This diversion of attention can be seen in various historical and contemporary contexts. For example, during periods of economic hardship, political leaders may exploit social divisions by scapegoating minority groups or marginalized communities, blaming them for the struggles faced by the majority. By creating a sense of otherness, they distract from the real causes of poverty, unemployment, or inequality, namely, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. People become so focused on attacking the scapegoat that they fail to question the policies or economic systems that allow the rich to grow richer, while the poor become even more disenfranchised. This is a classic tactic used by those in power to ensure that their grip remains unchallenged. The danger of division is also seen in the way it prevents solidarity. When people are divided, they are less likely to recognize their shared struggles. Whether it is workers fighting for better wages or marginalized communities fighting for equal rights, the power of collective action is rooted in the recognition that these struggles are interconnected. However, when people are pitted against each other, this recognition becomes obscured. The struggles of one group are seen as irrelevant to others, and as a result, people who could otherwise be allies become enemies. This fragmentation weakens the potential for solidarity, making it harder to build the broad-based movements needed to confront the real sources of oppression. Without solidarity, each group fights alone, making it easier for the forces of oppression to maintain their dominance. Moreover, division erodes empathy and understanding. When we are divided, we see the other as a threat, as someone whose interests conflict with our own. This leads to hostility and fear, making it difficult to engage in dialogue, to listen, and to find common ground. Division creates a cycle of mistrust and resentment, where each side believes that they are justified in their anger, and that the other side is beyond reach. In this environment, reconciliation becomes almost impossible, and the divisions become entrenched, passed down from generation to generation. The lack of empathy not only harms relationships between individuals and communities, but also undermines the collective will to address social issues. Empathy is the foundation of social progress. Without it, there can be no meaningful movement toward justice. Finally, division stunts our collective progress. The more divided we are, the less able we are to build the kind of world that we all deserve. The struggles of the oppressed, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised cannot be solved in isolation. They require a united effort, a shared vision, and a willingness to work together to dismantle the structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice. But division makes it harder for people to come together and find that common vision. Instead of working towards shared goals, people become mired in conflict, often over issues that, in the grand scheme of things, are less important than the larger battles for justice. When we are divided, we lose sight of the common humanity that binds us, and our ability to achieve meaningful change becomes diminished. In the end, division is a force that seeks to weaken us, to turn us against one another, and to prevent us from achieving the collective power necessary to create a just and equitable world. It is the job of those who seek justice, peace, and equality to resist division in all its forms, to see beyond the lines that separate us, and to recognize that we are stronger when we stand together. Only through unity, empathy, and solidarity can we hope to confront the real enemies of oppression, inequality, and injustice. Throughout history, one of the most effective tools used to control and manipulate populations has been the creation of false narratives. These narratives serve to create and sustain divisions among people, particularly by labeling others as enemies. When these enemies are portrayed as threatening, dangerous, or even subhuman, it becomes easier to justify discrimination, violence, and war. The false narrative of an enemy often becomes so deeply ingrained that it transcends reason, shaping how people view entire groups, cultures, or nations. This manipulation of perception can have far-reaching consequences, leading to societal division, prolonged conflicts, and a deepening of mistrust between individuals and communities who should otherwise be united in the fight against real sources of injustice. False narratives of enemies typically begin with the need to create another someone who is different and thus threatening to the status quo or to the perceived welfare of a particular group. It is often easier to rally people around a common cause when they have an enemy to focus on, a scapegoat to blame for their struggles. This tactic is not new. It has been used throughout history to justify wars, colonization, slavery, and other forms of oppression. By identifying a common enemy, leaders and powers have been able to unite people under the banner of patriotism, nationalism, or a shared sense of fear. The enemy, often fabricated or exaggerated, becomes the focus of a campaign of vilification, making it easier to rally the masses to support actions that otherwise might be unthinkable. One of the most powerful ways in which false narratives of enemies are constructed is through propaganda. Governments, political leaders, and institutions use various forms of media, whether it be print, radio, television, or social media, to shape the way people perceive the world around them. They create a distorted image of the enemy, often portraying them as a monolithic, malevolent force that seeks to harm, control, or destroy. This narrative is repeated so often that it becomes accepted as truth, and individuals no longer question the motivations or actions of those they are told to fear. The enemy is painted as not just an opponent, but as a threat to everything that is considered good, right, or just. In times of war, for example, it is common for governments to paint the opposing side as barbaric, irrational, or even evil. The atrocities committed by one side are often exaggerated or twisted to demonize the other. The images of enemy soldiers or civilians are shown as monstrous or subhuman, while the actions of one's own side are glorified, even when they may also be violent or unjust. This creates an atmosphere where any form of retaliation against the enemy is justified, and the moral compass of the public becomes skewed. The enemy is no longer seen as human. They are viewed as something to be feared, crushed, and eliminated. This dehumanization of the enemy allows for atrocities, war crimes, and violations of human rights to be committed with impunity. These false narratives are not confined to the battlefields of war. They are also used to justify the marginalization and persecution of minority groups. For instance, racial or religious minorities are often portrayed as threats to the dominant culture, with their existence framed as a challenge to the social order. By casting minorities as enemies, societies are more easily persuaded to enact discriminatory laws, policies, or practices. The narratives of danger and threat are constructed from biased stereotypes and misinformation, reinforcing prejudices that have existed for generations. In this way, the false narrative becomes self-reinforcing. The more a group is labeled as dangerous, the more people begin to treat them as such, creating a cycle of fear and suspicion. The danger of false narratives is that they simplify complex issues into digestible stories that are easier for people to accept without question. People are often not encouraged to critically examine the motives behind the narratives being presented to them. Instead, they are asked to believe in a simplistic dichotomy, us versus them. This binary thinking prevents any nuanced understanding of the world, ignoring the many shades of gray that exist in human behavior. It makes it easy to justify violence or mistreatment of those perceived as the enemy, while obscuring the systemic structures of power that truly contribute to inequality, injustice, and conflict. It distracts from the real sources of harm by focusing attention on fabricated threats. False narratives also work to reinforce existing power structures by focusing on the enemy rather than on the systems that perpetuate inequality. For example, in times of social unrest, the authorities may direct the public's attention toward external enemies or scapegoats, distracting from the internal issues that are causing harm. When people are made to believe that their enemy is a foreign power or a specific group within their own society, they are less likely to question the actions of those in power or to hold them accountable for the injustices they may be perpetrating. This allows the true sources of oppression to remain unchallenged, as people are too focused on the constructed narrative of the enemy to see the broader picture. Moreover, false narratives can create an atmosphere where reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. When an entire group or nation is cast as an enemy, it becomes difficult for individuals to see the humanity in those they are told to fear. This dehumanization makes it hard for any form of dialogue or understanding to occur, as both sides view each other as threats rather than as people with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. This perpetuates a cycle of conflict, where every encounter is seen as a battle, and every difference is a cause for suspicion. The ability to find common ground becomes buried under layers of hostility and distrust. The consequences of these false narratives can be devastating, not only for the groups targeted but also for the society as a whole. It leads to entrenched divisions, where people are divided into hostile factions with little hope for cooperation or understanding. It fosters a culture of fear, where individuals are taught to view the world in terms of adversaries rather than potential allies. It creates an environment where people are easily manipulated and exploited, as they are driven by irrational fear rather than by reason and compassion. Ultimately, the false narrative of enemies serves to perpetuate conflict and oppression. It distracts from the true sources of injustice, pits people against one another, and fosters a cycle of fear and hatred that is difficult to break. It is only by recognizing these narratives for what they are, tools of manipulation, that we can begin to dismantle them. We must reject the idea that anyone is inherently an enemy and instead strive to see each other as fellow human beings, capable of working together for a better future. Only then can we hope to break free from the cycle of division and build a world based on understanding, empathy, and justice. The concept of the true enemy is one that requires deep reflection, for in many instances, the true nature of our adversaries is often obscured, distorted, or entirely misrepresented. Historically, people have been taught to view specific individuals, groups, or nations as their enemies, and in doing so, they have been encouraged to channel their anger, fear, and resentment toward these external targets. Yet, when we examine the world through a more critical lens, we often find that the true enemy is not the one who has been portrayed to us by external forces, but rather the systems, ideologies, and structures that perpetuate oppression, inequality, and suffering. These forces are far more insidious and enduring than any individual or group we may be taught to oppose. They are deeply embedded in the very fabric of our societies, and they thrive by dividing us, perpetuating false narratives, and keeping us focused on external scapegoats rather than the internal systems of injustice that harm us all. The true enemy is not always immediately apparent, and this is why it is so dangerous. It is easy to look at a situation, identify a visible adversary, and focus all of one's energy on combating that person or group. But this reaction often distracts from the deeper, more systemic forces at play. For example, we might direct our anger at a particular political figure or an enemy nation. But the true forces at play, the corporate interests that fund political campaigns, the economic systems that perpetuate poverty, or the cultural ideologies that promote division remain largely untouched. In this way, the true enemy is the system itself, a system that manipulates individuals into focusing on visible adversaries, even while it continues to thrive in the shadows. One of the primary characteristics of this true enemy is its ability to hide in plain sight. It often doesn't have a clear, identifiable face or name. Unlike traditional enemies who can be easily targeted and defeated, the true enemy is a complex web of economic, political, and social structures that work together to perpetuate power imbalances. It is not a single person or a single group, but a deeply ingrained system that exploits human vulnerabilities, fear, greed, ignorance, and prejudice to maintain its control. This system operates through institutions like governments, corporations, media, and social systems, all of which work to keep people divided and distracted. By convincing people that their enemies are those who look different, think differently, or live in different places, the system diverts attention away from its own role in creating and sustaining injustice. Another defining characteristic of the true enemy is that it thrives on division. It benefits from pitting people against one another, whether through race, religion, nationality, or any other form of identity. The true enemy knows that if individuals or communities are united, they have the power to challenge and overthrow the systems that oppress them. Therefore, it seeks to foster division in every way possible. It creates false narratives of fear and hatred, encouraging us to see others as threats instead of allies. The true enemy plays on our differences, turning them into sources of conflict and misunderstanding, rather than recognizing them as opportunities for solidarity and strength. It's through this division that the true enemy remains in power, for a divided society is easier to control, as it prevents collective action and mutual support. The true enemy also feeds on inequality. It perpetuates systems that concentrate wealth, power, and resources in the hands of a few, while the majority struggle to meet basic needs. The economic systems that reward the rich and punish the poor are a direct manifestation of the true enemy. It is not individual rich people or corporate CEOs who are the true enemy, but the system that allows such extreme disparities to exist. This economic structure pits individuals against one another for access to limited resources, while the wealthy and powerful continue to amass more at the top. The true enemy ensures that the playing field is never level, and that the oppressed never have an equal chance to succeed or thrive. It is a system that requires inequality to function, for inequality breeds dependency, and dependency ensures control. Beyond economic inequality, the true enemy also manifests itself in social and racial inequality. Discrimination, prejudice, and bias are tools that maintain the status quo. The true enemy thrives on these divisions, using them to justify unjust systems of governance and laws that suppress the rights and freedoms of marginalized groups. Whether it's racial discrimination, gender inequality, or the oppression of sexual minorities, the true enemy lies in the beliefs, policies, and structures that allow such discrimination to continue. These systems are not easily dismantled because they are woven so deeply into the social fabric. However, by focusing on the true enemy, the systemic nature of inequality, we can begin to address the root causes of oppression and work toward a more just society for all. Another significant aspect of the true enemy is its ability to undermine collective consciousness. It seeks to prevent people from realizing the power they possess when they come together. It makes people believe that their struggles are isolated and individual, leading them to think that they must face their problems alone. The true enemy convinces us that our fight is against each other, be it through political ideologies, economic systems, or cultural battles, when in reality, the fight is against the very systems that perpetuate these divisions. When we are divided, we are less likely to challenge the powerful institutions that benefit from our disunity. The true enemy seeks to keep us focused on petty disagreements and distractions, diverting our attention from the larger systemic forces that hold the real power. Ultimately, the true enemy is the system of injustice that sustains itself by convincing us that our real fight lies elsewhere. It uses fear, division, and distraction to maintain control and ensure that its oppressive structures are never questioned. It convinces us that our enemies are the ones who appear different, who live in distant lands, or who hold opposing views, while it continues to operate in the background, manipulating events and outcomes for its own benefit. The real fight is not against these manufactured enemies, but against the systemic forces that breed inequality, fear, and division. Recognizing the true enemy requires a shift in perspective. It is not enough to fight against individual figures or groups that have been painted as adversaries. We must confront the larger systems of power, wealth, and privilege that perpetuate the cycle of oppression. The true enemy is the structure itself, the political, economic, and social systems that uphold inequality and prevent the realization of justice and equality for all people. By focusing on this deeper systemic enemy, we can begin to build a more equitable and compassionate world, one that recognizes the humanity in all people and seeks to dismantle the structures of oppression that harm us all. Rising above hatred is one of the most difficult and yet most necessary challenges we face as individuals and as a collective society. Hatred, like a poison, seeps into the fabric of human relations, distorting perceptions, inciting violence, and fostering division. It is an emotion that clouds judgment, prevents understanding, and ultimately leads to destruction. But while hatred can take root easily, it is not an inevitable force. We have the capacity as human beings to rise above it, to choose a path that rejects the corrosive influence of hatred in favor of love, compassion, and understanding. Rising above hatred requires not just individual effort but also collective will, as it involves dismantling the systems and beliefs that perpetuate animosity. It means challenging ourselves to think critically, to look beyond surface-level differences, and to see each other as fellow human beings deserving of respect and dignity. The first step in rising above hatred is recognizing it for what it is: a destructive force that undermines our humanity. Hatred does not come from a place of strength, but from vulnerability. It is often born of fear of the unknown, fear of difference, or fear of losing power or status. Those who harbor hatred often do so because they feel threatened or insecure. In a world where fear and insecurity run deep, it is easy to turn to hatred as a coping mechanism. When people feel powerless, they may seek to assert control by directing their anger toward others, labeling them as enemies. The object of hatred is typically someone or something that is perceived as different, whether in terms of race, religion, nationality, or ideology. Hatred is a distortion of the human spirit, an emotion that dehumanizes others and reduces them to mere symbols of what we fear or despise. To rise above hatred, we must first confront and challenge the sources of fear and insecurity that give rise to it. This requires a deep self-awareness and a willingness to examine our own biases and prejudices. It means acknowledging the parts of ourselves that harbor negativity toward others and understanding that these feelings are not rooted in truth but in the stories we have been told, the stereotypes we have internalized, or the insecurities we have yet to confront. We must be brave enough to dismantle these false beliefs, replacing them with empathy, compassion, and a commitment to seeing the humanity in others. Hatred is often an irrational response to something we do not understand, and by seeking to understand, whether through dialogue, education, or personal reflection, we can begin to dismantle the walls that hatred builds between us. Rising above hatred also requires an active effort to promote empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. It is the recognition that the pain, struggles, and joys of others are just as real and meaningful as our own. Empathy calls us to see beyond the labels and stereotypes that fuel hatred, to engage with others as individuals rather than as members of a group to be feared or despised. It asks us to reach across divides, to listen to the stories of those who are different from us, and to approach them with openness rather than judgment. By cultivating empathy, we begin to recognize the shared humanity in each person we encounter, regardless of their background or beliefs. In this way, empathy becomes a powerful antidote to hatred, for it challenges the belief that others are enemies and instead fosters the realization that we are all connected by our common human experience. However, rising above hatred is not only a personal journey, it is also a collective endeavor. Hatred is often propagated by societal structures, institutions, and narratives that seek to divide and conquer. Throughout history, rulers and power structures have used hatred as a tool to control populations, turning one group against another to prevent unity and collective action. In modern times, media, political rhetoric, and social platforms can amplify messages of hate, creating an environment where fear and division thrive. To rise above hatred, we must actively challenge these systems of division. This means not only rejecting the hateful rhetoric that seeks to pit us against one another, but also working toward a more inclusive, just, and equitable society. Rising above hatred requires dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice, for it is through these structures that hatred is allowed to flourish. One of the most powerful ways to rise above hatred is through the act of forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting the harm done or excusing the actions that cause pain, but it means releasing the grip that hatred has on our hearts and minds. Forgiveness is an act of liberation not for the one who has wronged us, but for ourselves. It is an acknowledgement that holding on to anger and resentment only perpetuates the cycle of hatred, preventing us from moving forward. Forgiveness allows us to rise above the desire for retribution, choosing instead the path of healing and reconciliation. It opens the door to understanding, enabling us to recognize the humanity in those who have hurt us and to seek a future free from the constraints of hatred and vengeance. Forgiveness is a courageous act, one that requires strength and vulnerability, but it is also a powerful way to break the cycle of hate that holds so many in its grip. In addition to forgiveness, rising above hatred involves cultivating love in all its forms. Love is the opposite of hatred. It is an embracing force that transcends boundaries and divisions. Love calls us to see the best in others, to seek common ground, and to support one another in times of need. Love is not a passive emotion, but an active choice. It requires us to act with kindness, to listen with compassion, and to respond with care. Love is what allows us to see beyond our differences and to build bridges where there were once walls. It is through love that we find the strength to forgive, to embrace empathy, and to work together to create a more peaceful world. Rising above hatred also requires us to acknowledge that this is an ongoing process. Hatred does not dissipate overnight. It is a deeply ingrained emotion that can take years, if not a lifetime, to overcome. It is something that requires constant self-reflection, constant effort, and constant vigilance. But the act of rising above hatred is also transformative. It has the power to heal not just individuals, but entire communities, nations, and even the world. When we choose to rise above hatred, we choose to be part of the solution, to create a world that values peace, understanding, and respect. Ultimately, rising above hatred is an act of strength and resilience. It is about transcending the negativity that seeks to pull us apart and choosing a path that brings us together. It is about recognizing that we all have the power to break the cycle of hatred, to choose love and compassion, and to create a future where understanding prevails over fear. By rising above hatred, we open the door to a world of possibility, one where unity, empathy, and kindness guide our actions and shape our collective future. Unity for justice is a powerful, transformative force that has the potential to reshape societies and uplift entire communities. It is through unity that individuals and groups come together to confront the injustices that persist in our world, whether these injustices are rooted in discrimination, inequality, exploitation, or oppression. Justice, in its truest form, is not just about legal or political processes, but about ensuring that every individual, regardless of their background, has access to the same rights, opportunities, and freedoms. Achieving justice requires that we recognize the shared humanity of all people and work collectively toward dismantling the systems and structures that perpetuate inequality and harm. Unity for justice is the bridge that can unite disparate voices and movements, transcending differences to create a collective power capable of challenging even the most entrenched systems of injustice. At its core, unity for justice is a response to the realities of division and fragmentation that often permeate our societies. Historically, injustice has been maintained by dividing people, by creating categories of us versus them, by pitting groups against one another based on race, class, gender, religion, or nationality. These divisions are not natural, but rather are socially constructed and reinforced by those in power to maintain control. The idea of unity then becomes radical, as it demands that we look past superficial differences and come together for a common cause, the realization of justice for all. When people unite, they bring together a multitude of perspectives, experiences, and strengths, and it is through this diverse collective power that meaningful change can emerge. One of the greatest challenges to achieving justice is the tendency to focus on individual struggles in isolation, rather than recognizing that these struggles are interconnected. For example, the fight for racial equality cannot be separated from the fight for economic justice, nor can the struggle for gender equality be divorced from the broader fight against colonialism or imperialism. Injustice does not operate in silos, it is multifaceted and interwoven into every aspect of society. Unity for justice, therefore, requires that we see these struggles as part of a broader system of oppression and work toward addressing all forms of injustice, not just the ones that directly affect us. This collective approach creates a stronger, more inclusive movement, as it recognizes that the liberation of one group is inextricably tied to the liberation of all. Achieving unity for justice also involves recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. It is only through a deep respect for each other's humanity that true justice can be realized. Unity requires that we listen to the voices of those who have been silenced and marginalized, offering them not only a platform, but also the solidarity necessary to create real change. It means centering the experiences of those most impacted by injustice, whether they are communities of color, the economically disadvantaged, refugees, or other oppressed groups. When we work in solidarity, we create a movement that is not about charity or saviorism, but about amplifying the voices of those who have been historically excluded and giving them the agency to define their own path toward justice. The path to justice through unity is not always easy. It requires deep commitment and the willingness to confront difficult truths. In many instances, those who are in positions of power will resist efforts toward justice, fearing that their privilege and control will be threatened. To challenge these systems, unity must extend across communities and borders, demanding that those who have the ability to effect change stand in solidarity with those who have been oppressed. This is where the power of collective action comes into play. By uniting large numbers of people behind a shared vision of justice, movements gain the strength needed to push back against entrenched systems of power. Whether through protests, boycotts, or political advocacy, collective action gives voice to those who have been silenced and creates a force that cannot be easily ignored. Furthermore, unity for justice involves a commitment to nonviolent resistance and the principles of peace and respect. While it is understandable that people who have been oppressed may feel anger or frustration, it is through nonviolent action that movements gain broad support and legitimacy. Nonviolence, as advocated by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., is not simply the absence of violence, but a positive commitment to peaceful methods of resistance and change. It involves confronting injustice with love, compassion, and a deep belief in the possibility of a better world. Nonviolence disarms those who perpetuate injustice by showing that the power of unity, driven by moral strength, is far more potent than any force of oppression. For unity to be sustained and effective, it must be rooted in a sense of shared responsibility and mutual accountability. Justice is not a one-time event, but a continuous process that requires the active participation of everyone involved. Those who are part of movements for justice must be willing to listen to one another, to learn from each other's experiences, and to support one another in both the victories and setbacks along the way. Unity means recognizing that no single individual or group holds all the answers, and that justice requires a collective effort in which everyone's voice is heard and valued. Mutual accountability also means that those who have benefited from systems of privilege must be willing to confront their own complicity in injustice and work actively to dismantle the structures that uphold inequality. Ultimately, unity for justice is about creating a future in which all people can live with dignity, equality, and freedom. It is about breaking down the barriers that divide us and replacing them with bonds of solidarity and shared purpose. Achieving justice is not a destination but a journey, and it is a journey that requires each of us to examine our own role in perpetuating injustice and to commit to the collective action needed to create a fairer, more just world. Unity for justice is not a passive aspiration, it is an active, ongoing commitment to making the world a better place for everyone, especially for those who have been left behind or oppressed. When we unite for justice, we do not just fight against the forces of inequality, we build a vision of a new world where justice is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. This vision, born from collective action, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment, can transform society, healing divisions and ensuring that every individual, regardless of their identity, has the opportunity to live a life free from fear, injustice, and discrimination. In the end, the true power of unity for justice lies in its ability to uplift the human spirit and create a world where justice is no longer a dream, but a reality for all.